Okay, let's talk about opposition, defiance, and anger. I know these are heavy topics, and it's very painful to see someone you care about going through this kind of suffering, and especially with this topic. But I found some really key principles and things to do that you can start to shift and, more importantly, understand why someone's behaving this way. Okay, so first thing is, I found that understanding why someone is behaving is more important than doing something about it. Why? Because understanding shapes strategy. Understanding shapes approaches. So we're going to spend the first part of this video understanding why and using principles to understand why people are behaving this way. Okay? So principle one, hurt people hurt people. When someone's pain has gotten so big that they start inflicting it onto other people, it means that they've gone beyond their threshold of being able to tolerate and navigate suffering, right? So they usually, these people who, these young people especially, aren't the type of people that would usually lash out at people. Maybe when they were a child, they were very sweet and kind, but now they're struggling in such a way that it goes out onto their world. It's as if their suffering goes from beyond their own threshold of their body, of their world, and they start putting it out into other people. Hurt people hurt other people. Those are the only kind of people that hurt people, is people who are feeling hurt themselves. When we think about this, young people are so sensitive and can feel a lot, not only in themselves, but in their environment. And sometimes it just becomes all too much that they just can't deal with it all, right? So there are three ways that I've seen people deal with this. One, they get depressed, meaning they push all of their emotions down. You can see my video on depression. Two, they deal with it by feeling anxious, by getting anxious, because all of those emotional commodities are bouncing around inside of them. You can see what I have to say about anxiety in my video there. Or in this case, they get very angry. They push back. They refuse to do what is asked of them, and they start pushing back on everything. There's a lot of reasons why people do that. But we'll start with the understanding that hurt people, okay? Very important for understanding. And before we even do anything, we understand that principle. Number two, it's easier for them to be angry than vulnerable in this stage. Meaning, let's say we have a young man, his name is Pablo. He's always been a very sweet boy. He was kind to others. He shared his toys when he was a kid. He had a big heart. And then as he started to enter adolescence, he started to become more selfish, more rude, more angry and short with other people. He stopped following what authority figures asked him to do, teachers and coaches. He used to have a really good relationship with them, but not so much anymore. So what happened? Well, if we go back to principle one, he's definitely hurting inside. Absolutely. And by the way, don't try to convince your kids that you know they're hurting, because it'll just give them another reason to be more angry, okay? So just keep this information for yourself and with your partners or co-parents that you're working with. So in principle two, as disappointed and as sad as you are, obviously, and hurting as you are to see him struggling, you've got to remember that he's hurting inside. And at this stage, principle two, it's easier to be angry than to be vulnerable. Why? Well, for them, vulnerability is weakness, and expressing weakness means that they could be hurt from some way from the outside, or that they could feel more hurt than they're already overwhelmed in feeling. You know what I mean? So why is anger so much more effective than being open, at least for now? Well, it's easier because to not be angry means that they would have to be vulnerable, and being vulnerable is just intolerable. Okay, that's the second principle. Third principle, accountability takes vulnerability. So if we go back to talking about to the principle of how being angry is easier than being vulnerable, remember that accountability takes vulnerability. So for me to say, you know, I made this mistake and I can see how it impacted you, and I really regret that I did this. I'm really sorry. You can tell I've kind of softened, my guard is lowered, and I'm being pretty vulnerable with you. I mean, even though I'm just making this up, you could probably feel that I'm kind of, open with you here in a certain way, right? But for young people who are really struggling and are oppositional, it leaves them open for being attacked. They've probably been attacked. They've probably been hurt. I mean, emotionally attacked, maybe physically, but they're hurting for some reason. And it may not be objective hurt or objective attack. It's perceptive. It's how it felt in any circumstance or situation or relationship, okay? So remember, it's easier for them to be angry than to be vulnerable. They're so fearful of being attacked that they bristle at the idea of being vulnerable, of being open, of softening. People who can take ownership are secure enough in themselves to be vulnerable. People that can take accountability, people that can apologize, maybe you and I, right? Because we, or those people, they're not worried about getting kind of attacked or pounced on typically, you know? They're not worried that like someone's going to be like, that's right, you did F up and you're an idiot and a failure, never do it again. Think about it. That's probably what your young person is feeling like something is going to happen. Again, it's perceived, not objective, right? So we're really getting inside the young person to understand, form compassion, and have that inform what we do. Principle 3, it's easier to be angry than to be vulnerable. Okay, so we could say a lot more about this than I do in my online course, but let's now go to what we do, okay? So the first thing that you're going to want to do is interrupt the anger cycle, meaning don't let yourself get angry because of their anger, right? It's okay to feel angry, to feel frustrated, to feel upset, to feel protective of the family, but navigate that. Get yourself to a point of feeling softer with them, to feeling more open, to being vulnerable yourself. If you can interrupt that cycle of anger begetting anger and getting angry because they're angry, you give yourself a shot to interrupt their own anger cycle, right? And of protection and of defensiveness, right? So that's the first thing you do is start with yourself. Interrupt the anger cycle. Get to a place where you can be soft within yourself and vulnerable and soft with them, okay? So secondly, this is a good segue. Give them a reason to soften. Develop yourself in a way that gives them a compelling reason to soften. What do I mean by that? Well, when people soften, first of all, when other people soften, they tend to have a greater ability to take ownership of themselves. As we talked about, to be accountable means that you have the ability to be vulnerable. So we want to give them a reason, not convince them, give them a reason where they start to dabble with being vulnerable themselves. Because if they can be vulnerable, they can take ownership. And if they can take ownership, then we can start to work as a team and start to work through some things. But they're not going to get vulnerable just because you tell them to, right? So let me give you an example. So just a little dialogue here. So sweetie, let's say there's a young person here in front of me, okay? Sweetie, I see you acting this way and it's really hard for me. Now, you don't have to take care of me. I'm just saying I can see you struggling in there and I don't know what to do, to be honest. I'm not sure what to do. I'm here to understand what you're going through, even if there's nothing I can really do to help. All right, I leave it at that. They don't say anything. Okay, well, I'll leave it at that. My door's open, and I can tell you're probably not going to receive this well, but you can't go out tonight. So I'm holding a boundary with you, okay? The destruction you did in your room has got to get dealt with, and you got to clean that up. And before anything happens. I know you're not going to like that, and that's just the way it's going to be. And listen, I'll even help you clean up your room if you want, and I'll even take you up to P.F. Chang's if you want, right? Okay, let's finish the role play there. So you can tell I was softening in my own way. I was also trying to meeting them halfway with something. Some people may call that enabling. I don't really buy into that whole enabling thing if your goal is to get a connection with them. You've got to do something about it eventually and bring back the boundaries in a tight way. But at this stage, we're in survival mode. We're just trying to get connected with our young person. They are lost. So if I'm going to feed them some great Chinese food to get something done that they're going to feel better about later, that's okay. Let yourself do that occasionally. Now, if it becomes a pattern, then that's something else that has to get discussed, all right? Okay, so you really want to develop yourself to be someone that models being secure in yourself, that models taking ownership. I could have said in that role play, I realize that I do not handle our relationship when you get really angry. I get reactive and then I shut down. And I know that's not great, but I am absolutely working on it, right? So you can tell I'm taking ownership. I'm being vulnerable there. They might attack me or they might say something to me that's disrespectful. Fine, right? Develop myself to be someone who's resilient, who's secure enough in myself that I can be vulnerable with them. And yes, so that I'm modeling it, but just for me. Because it's a good person, because I'll be happier, I'll be more resilient. And then I'll be able to be a better parent, right? And then it might be modeling. But modeling, it's underrated if you ask me, okay? So do it for you. Do it to inform your strategy, because that's really that's what shapes and educates a young person, is how we are, not what we say, okay? Okay, so the third and final step to take when navigating a person who's oppositional and you're working with them is that structure and boundaries are meant to do one thing. And I've never heard anybody else say this: inspire young people to become more independent. Now listen to this. Structure is meant to inspire. That's what it really is. Why? Because however you communicate structure and what the structure looks like, they are going to take in themselves and walk into their world and do it that way. So meaning when they have to do something for themselves and no one's holding them accountable, meaning like the job or a relationship or something like that, they will do boundaries. They will express boundaries and structure the way that you communicated it and in the style that you shared it with them. So your structure and boundaries are meant to inspire them to become more independent. Yes, obviously structure and boundaries are there to keep them safe, but that's like elementary school. We're teaching you to be more sophisticated, okay? Many parents aren't clear about the intent of their boundaries because it wasn't something they were taught at parenting school, right? So be clear on what your intent is behind your boundaries when you're navigating and parenting and being in relationship with your angry child, right? What's the intent? Is the intent to punish them? Is the intent to teach them a lesson? Because my experience, that doesn't work. They might behave a little bit better for a minute, but they're not going to become the kind of person that you want them to be. So make the structure and boundaries, again, inspire. I put that in quotes because we do want them to feel like it's important to do that. And there's a whole world that I'll talk about in another video and on my online course about how to actually inspire people to, it doesn't mean you don't have to enjoy boundaries in order to be inspired by them, okay? It doesn't have to be pleasurable in order to be inspired. Pain and restriction and all of those things can inspire people to act differently and to become different people. There's countless examples of that in humanity. So that's what we're going for, is that structure is meant to inspire them to perform, to behave, and ultimately to feel and think a certain way, okay? So let's recap, all right? So there are 3 principles to understand when young people are oppositional. Here are the principles. Hurt people hurt people. They're acting this way because they're hurt. Number 2, it's easier for them to be angry than it is for them to be vulnerable, okay? They're hurt and they're insecure inside, and it's hard for them to be vulnerable. Understanding that helps us soften. When they're pushing people away in their anger, it's often because they're betraying their own values, and on top of that, it's a whole nother anger cycle that's happening, right? They're angry at themselves as well, okay? Number 3, accountability takes vulnerability. Remember this. If I'm going to say, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. You can probably feel that right now. I'm being vulnerable with you, and I'm just saying those words. But I've practiced enough softening within myself, and I'm secure enough in myself to be vulnerable in most situations. I want you to do that too, right? Because you want to inspire them to be differently, to behave differently, to think differently, to feel differently. And having a connection like you there with someone who can be vulnerable will inspire them. It can inspire them. It gives them the possibility. And there are 3 things to do. There are many things to do, but here are 3 that I think are insightful. 1, don't provoke their anger with your own. Interrupt the cycle of anger, creating anger in you. So navigate your own anger, frustration, hurt inside of yourself to be able to be clear, to be able to seek to understand what they're going through, and to be able to be more resilient. Number 2, what to do? Give them a reason to soften, a compelling reason to soften. Create a standard for yourself around how you show up with them. Be open and clear. Navigate your own adversities so that you can be a better person and feel better, right? Family, this is a side point, but also related. Families are not a democracy. You're in charge, and you can be kind, compassionate, and a connected leader of the family, right? Not an angry, reactive dictator. All right. Finally, the 3rd thing that you can do, promote a structure that inspires responsibility and independence. Structure is to serve one purpose: inspire them to become independent, right? So you might have to limit their independence for a time in order to inspire them to want to become independent. Now, but the intent behind this is not to punish them. It's that they haven't proven that they're responsible enough to handle independence. You can even say that, right? You're not acting in a way that inspires me to want you to like go out into the world and do whatever you want, but I do want that for you. But it would be irresponsible of me as the parent if I let you take the keys tonight after you drove drunk home the other night, right? So give them examples of how you can inspire you to trust them again, right? Sharing their feelings, talking about what they're struggling with. Yes, behaving, but we really want to get their world, and ultimately the best way to get that world is for them to tell us, right? There's a whole other video on how to speak with your kids and be with your kids in a way that they'll open up, all right? So listen, I know if you're watching this can be a hard moment. And I've got to tell you that I've been through this thousands of times with young people and families, and there is a way out when you start applying these kind of principles and strategies, okay? You got this. I'm with you, and all the best.